The sound of her violin cut through the chaos of Jamestown, Colorado, like a bird's song through a thunderstorm, and Ethan Whitmore stopped dead in his tracks, forgetting entirely about the supplies he needed to buy before heading back to his ranch. He stood there in the dusty street, his worn leather boots planted firmly in the dirt, watching as the young woman drew her bow across the strings with such passion that even the rowdy miners stumbling out of the saloon paused to listen. Her dress was faded and patched in several places, the hem stained with mud, but she held herself with a dignity that seemed to transcend her circumstances. A battered violin case lay open at her feet, containing only a few copper coins that glinted in the late afternoon sun of September 1882. Ethan had seen plenty of unusual sights in his 26 years, especially in the 4 years since he'd left his family's failing farm in Missouri and headed west to make something of himself. He'd worked himself nearly to death building up his cattle ranch on the outskirts of town, spending his days mending fences, breaking horses, and driving cattle to market. But he'd never seen anything quite like this woman with her violin, standing on the corner of Main Street and 2nd Avenue as if she owned the entire territory. Her dark hair was pinned up haphazardly, with several strands escaping to frame her face, and her eyes were closed as she played, her entire being focused on the music flowing from her instrument. The song she played was something Ethan didn't recognize, something that sounded both mournful and hopeful at the same time. It made him think of his mother, who died when he was 15, and the lullabies she used to hum while she worked. It made him think of everything he'd lost and everything he was still fighting to build. When the song ended, he found himself clapping along with the small crowd that had gathered, and he pulled a silver dollar from his pocket and dropped it into her case before he could think better of it. Her eyes opened then, and they were the color of amber, warm and bright despite the weariness etched into her features. She couldn't have been more than 22 or 23, Ethan guessed, though the hardness in her gaze suggested she'd lived through more than most people twice her age. She looked at him directly, and something in that gaze made his heart stutter in his chest. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice soft but clear. It carried the faint trace of an accent he couldn't quite place, something Eastern perhaps, refined in a way that seemed at odds with her current circumstances. Ethan touched the brim of his hat, suddenly feeling awkward and tongue-tied in a way he hadn't experienced since he was a boy. "That was beautiful, miss. I've never heard anything like it." A small smile tugged at the corner of her lips, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "You're kind to say so." She bent to collect the coins from her case, counting them quickly with practiced efficiency. Ethan noticed that her hands were calloused, the fingertips of her left hand particularly rough from pressing against the violin strings. "You play out here often?" he asked, not quite ready to walk away even though he knew he should. The sun was already beginning its descent toward the mountains, and he had an hour's ride back to his ranch. "Every day for the past 3 weeks," she replied, carefully placing the coins into a small cloth purse she kept tucked inside her case. "It's honest work, and the people here have been generous for the most part." "You new to Jamestown, then?" She straightened up, meeting his eyes again. "Yes, I arrived from Philadelphia in early August." "My name is Adelaide Turner, though I suppose introductions are a bit formal for a street corner." "Ethan Whitmore," he said, extending his hand. She hesitated for just a moment before taking it, and her grip was firm despite her delicate appearance. "What brings you all the way out here from Philadelphia? That's quite a journey." Something shuddered in her expression, and she withdrew her hand. "The same thing that brings most people west, I suppose. A fresh start." Her tone made it clear that she wasn't going to elaborate, and Ethan knew better than to press. Everyone in the territories had a past they were running from or trying to forget. "Well, I hope Jamestown treats you well," he said, touching his hat again. "I'll look forward to hearing you play again." He forced himself to turn and walk toward the general store, though he could feel her watching him go. As he gathered the supplies he needed, flour and coffee and ammunition for his rifle, he found his thoughts drifting back to the woman on the corner. Adelaide Turner. Even her name sounded like music. Over the next several weeks, Ethan found himself making excuses to come into town more often than was strictly necessary. His ranch hands teased him about it, saying he was wearing out his horse with all the trips back and forth, but he didn't care. Every time he visited Jamestown, he made sure to stop by the corner where Adelaide played. Sometimes he would linger for just one song, and sometimes he would stand there for an hour, listening to her play everything from lively jigs that made people want to dance to slow, haunting melodies that brought tears to the eyes of hardened miners. He learned things about her gradually, in small pieces like a puzzle being assembled one fragment at a time. She was 23 years old, 3 years younger than him. She'd been trained at a music conservatory in Philadelphia, which explained her skill and the refined way she carried herself. She'd come west alone, which was unusual enough to raise eyebrows but not unheard of in these times when women were increasingly striking out on their own. She was staying in a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Henderson, and by all accounts, she was a model tenant who paid her rent on time and caused no trouble. What Ethan couldn't understand was why someone with her obvious talent was playing on street corners instead of performing in concert halls. Philadelphia had plenty of opportunities for a skilled violinist, didn't it? What had driven her to abandon all of that and come to a rough mining town in the Colorado mountains? He finally worked up the courage to ask her one October afternoon, when the aspen trees had turned gold, and the air held the first real bite of approaching winter. He just sold a string of horses to the army and was feeling flush with success, and when he saw Adelaide packing up her violin as the sun began to set, he approached her before he could talk himself out of it. "Miss Turner, might I buy you supper?" he asked. "There's a decent restaurant just down the street, and I'd like to talk with you if you're willing." She looked at him for a long moment, her amber eyes searching his face as if trying to determine his intentions. He kept his expression open and honest, letting her see that he meant no harm. Finally, she nodded slowly. "I suppose that would be acceptable. Thank you, Mr. Whitmore." "Ethan, please," he said, offering his arm. After a brief hesitation, she took it, and they walked together down Main Street to the Silver Fork restaurant, which was the nicest establishment in town that would serve a woman without a chaperone. The restaurant was busy with the evening crowd, mostly miners and cowboys and the occasional family from one of the nearby ranches. The owner, a portly man named George Murphy, showed them to a table near the back where they could talk without shouting over the general din. Ethan ordered steak for both of them, along with potatoes and carrots and fresh bread, and coffee to drink. He noticed the way Adelaide's eyes widened slightly when the food arrived, the portions generous and steaming hot, and he wondered when she'd last had a proper meal. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes, and then Ethan cleared his throat. "I hope you don't think I'm being too forward, but I've been wondering about you, about why someone with your talent is playing on street corners instead of in concert halls." Adelaide set down her fork carefully, her expression growing guarded. "That's a long story and not a particularly pleasant one. I've got time if you're willing to tell it." She was quiet for so long that Ethan thought she might refuse to answer. But then she took a sip of her coffee and began to speak, her voice low and controlled. I was engaged to be married back in Philadelphia, to a man named Charles Pemberton. He was from a wealthy family, well connected in society. My father was a music professor at the conservatory, but we were not wealthy ourselves. When Charles showed interest in me, my father was thrilled. He saw it as a way to secure my future. Ethan felt a knot forming in his stomach, but he said nothing, letting her continue at her own pace. Charles seemed kind at first, Adelaide went on, staring down at her plate. Attentive and generous. But after we became engaged, he began to change. He didn't want me to perform in public anymore. He said it was unseemly for his future wife to be displaying herself on stage. He wanted me to give up the violin entirely once we were married, to focus on managing his household and bearing his children. That seems like a waste of your talent, Ethan said quietly. A bitter smile crossed Adelaide's face. I thought so too. But when I tried to discuss it with him, he became angry. He told me that I was being ungrateful, that I should be honored he'd chosen me despite my family's modest circumstances. And then one night, during an argument, he struck me. Ethan's hands clenched into fists under the table, anger surging through him at the thought of anyone hurting her. It was only once, Adelaide continued, but it was enough. I realized that if I married him, my life would not be my own, so I broke off the engagement. Charles was furious and his family was scandalized. They spread rumors about me, saying that I was unstable and ungrateful. My father was so humiliated that he disowned me. He said I'd thrown away my only chance at a good life. So you came west, Ethan finished. She nodded. I used what little money I had saved to buy a train ticket to Colorado. I'd heard that the mining towns were full of people looking for fresh starts, that no one cared much about your past as long as you were willing to work. And I was right. Playing on street corners isn't glamorous, but it's honest work, and I answer to no one but myself. Ethan leaned back in his chair, processing everything she'd told him. He understood now the hardness he'd seen in her eyes, the way she held herself with such fierce independence. She'd lost everything rather than compromise who she was, and he admired her courage even as his heart ached for what she'd endured. I'm sorry you went through that, he said finally, but for what it's worth, I think you made the right choice. Any man who would try to take away the thing you love most isn't worth having. Adelaide met his eyes, and for the first time since he'd known her, he saw her guard drop just a little. Thank you, Ethan. That means more than you know. They talked for another hour, the conversation flowing more easily now that the difficult part was behind them. Ethan told her about his ranch, about the satisfaction he found in working the land and building something with his own hands. He told her about growing up in Missouri, about losing his mother and watching his father drink himself to death in the years that followed. He told her about his dream of turning his modest ranch into something prosperous enough to support a family. When they finally left the restaurant, the street was dark except for the lights spilling from saloon windows and the occasional lantern hung outside a shop. Ethan walked Adelaide back to her boarding house, and when they reached the front steps, she turned to face him. Thank you for the meal and the conversation, she said. It's been a long time since I felt like I could talk honestly with anyone. The pleasure was mine, Ethan replied. Adelaide, I'd like to see you again. Outside of your performances, I mean. Would that be agreeable to you? She studied his face in the dim light and he held his breath, waiting for her answer. Yes, she said finally. I think I'd like that very much. Ethan felt his heart soar, though he kept his expression calm. How about Sunday? I could take you for a ride out to my ranch, show you the land. I promise to have you back before dark. That sounds lovely, Adelaide said, a genuine smile lighting up her face for the first time since he'd met her. As Ethan rode back to his ranch that night, the darkness broken only by the light of a half-moon, he found himself whistling one of the melodies Adelaide had played. He'd been focused for so long on building his ranch, on proving to himself that he could make something of his life, that he'd forgotten what it felt like to look forward to something beyond the next day's work. But now, thinking about Sunday and the chance to spend more time with Adelaide, he felt a spark of something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. True to his word, Ethan arrived at the boarding house on Sunday morning with his wagon freshly cleaned and his best horse, Ranger, in the traces. He'd spent an embarrassing amount of time that morning making sure he looked presentable, trimming his beard and putting on his newest shirt, the blue one without any patches or stains. When Adelaide came out, wearing a simple green dress that brought out the warmth in her eyes, he was struck once again by how beautiful she was, not in a delicate, ornamental way, but in a way that spoke of strength and character. The ride out to his ranch took about an hour, and they talked easily the whole way, sharing stories and observations about the changing season and the mountains looming in the distance. Adelaide mentioned that she'd never learned to ride a horse, which seemed almost impossible to Ethan, who'd been riding since he was old enough to sit in a saddle. He immediately offered to teach her, and the delight that lit up her face made him glad he'd suggested it. His ranch wasn't much to look at yet, just a modest cabin he'd built himself, a barn that was sturdy if not pretty, and several corrals and pastures where his cattle and horses grazed. But he was proud of it, proud of every board he'd nailed and every fence post he'd set. He'd named it the Whitmore Ranch, simple and straightforward, and he had plans to expand it gradually over the coming years. Adelaide surprised him by being genuinely interested in everything he showed her. She asked intelligent questions about the cattle and the horses, about the challenges of ranching in the mountains where the winters were harsh and the growing season was short. She admired the cabin he'd built, running her hand along the smooth logs and compliments his craftsmanship. And when he showed her the view from the hill behind his cabin, looking out over the valley with the mountains rising up beyond, she was silent for a long moment before speaking. "It's beautiful, Ethan," she said softly. "You've built something wonderful here." "It's just a start," he replied. "But thank you. It means a lot to hear you say that." They had lunch sitting on the porch of his cabin, simple fare of bread and cheese and apples that Ethan had bought in town, but Adelaide seemed to enjoy it. Afterward, he brought out Daisy, his gentlest mare, and spent the afternoon teaching Adelaide the basics of riding. She was nervous at first, gripping the reins too tightly and sitting too stiffly in the saddle, but gradually she relaxed and began to find her rhythm. By the time the sun began to set, she was able to walk Daisy around the corral without Ethan having to lead her, and her laughter rang out clear and joyful as she made her first successful turn. On the ride back to town, Adelaide was quiet, but it was a comfortable silence. When they reached the boarding house and Ethan helped her down from the wagon, she placed her hand on his arm. "Thank you for today," she said. "I haven't felt this happy in a very long time. We could do it again next Sunday if you'd like," Ethan offered, hoping he didn't sound too eager. "Maybe by spring, you'll be good enough to ride Daisy all the way out to the ranch yourself." "I'd like that," Adelaide said. And then, before Ethan could react, she stood on her toes and pressed a quick kiss to his cheek before hurrying up the steps and into the house. Ethan stood there for a moment, his hand touching the spot where her lips had been, feeling like a fool with the wide grin he couldn't keep off his face. He climbed back into his wagon and headed home, already counting the days until Sunday came around again. Through October and into November, Ethan and Adelaide fell into a pattern. He would come to town during the week to listen to her play and to bring her small gifts, nothing extravagant, just things he thought she might enjoy. A warm shawl for when the weather turned cold. A book of poetry he'd ordered specially from Denver. Fresh vegetables from the garden he'd planted behind his cabin. And every Sunday, he would take her out to the ranch, and they would spend the day together, riding and talking and simply enjoying each other's company. Adelaide continued to play on her street corner, though Ethan noticed that the weather was getting harder on her. The November wind cut through Jamestown with a bitter chill, and even with the shawl he'd given her, she would shiver as she played. Her hands would grow stiff with cold, affecting her ability to move her fingers quickly across the strings. Several times, he arrived to find her packing up early because the cold had become too much to bear. It worried him more than he wanted to admit. He knew that winter in the Colorado mountains was brutal, and the thought of Adelaide standing outside in the snow and ice, trying to earn enough to pay her rent and buy food, made him feel sick. He wanted to help her, to offer her money or a place to stay, but he knew she was too proud to accept charity. She'd come west to make her own way, and she wouldn't thank him for treating her like someone who needed to be rescued. But maybe, he thought, there was another way he could help. An idea had been forming in his mind for weeks now, growing stronger every time he watched her play, every time he saw the way people stopped to listen to her music. Adelaide Turner was talented enough to perform in concert halls, but Jamestown didn't have anything like that. What it did have was plenty of people hungry for entertainment and beauty in their hard lives, and plenty of wealthy mine owners who wouldn't blink at spending money if it meant impressing their peers. The more Ethan thought about it, the more the idea took shape. What Adelaide needed wasn't a street corner. She needed a proper stage, a place where people could come specifically to hear her play, where she would be sheltered from the weather and could charge admission instead of relying on whatever coins people chose to drop in her case. And if such a place didn't exist in Jamestown, well, maybe it was time someone built it. Ethan began making inquiries, carefully and quietly so as not to raise Adelaide's suspicions. He talked to the banker, Mr. Stevens, about taking out a loan. He talked to the owner of the lumber mill about the cost of materials. He rode out to a piece of land he owned on Main Street, a lot he'd bought 2 years ago thinking he might build a storefront someday, and tried to envision what could be built there. The more he learned, the more daunting the project seemed. Building a proper theater or music hall would be expensive, far more expensive than anything he'd undertaken before. He would have to take out a significant loan, putting up his ranch as collateral. If the venture failed, he could lose everything he'd worked for. But every time doubt crept in, he would think of Adelaide standing on that cold street corner, her fingers stiff and her face pale with cold, and his resolve would strengthen. He wanted to do this for her, not just because he was falling in love with her, though he was, but because she deserved better than what life had given her so far. By early December, Ethan had a plan. He'd secured the loan from Mr. Stevens, who'd been surprisingly supportive once Ethan explained what he wanted to build and why. The banker had heard Adelaide play and agreed that Jamestown could use a venue for cultural entertainment. Ethan had hired a small crew of carpenters and laborers, men who needed work now that the construction season was winding down. And he'd drawn up plans for a building that would be part concert hall, part community gathering space, with a proper stage and seating for about 100 people. There was just one problem. He hadn't told Adelaide any of this. He wanted it to be a surprise, wanted to see her face when he showed her the finished building. But he also knew that she might not react the way he hoped. She was independent and proud, and she might see his gesture as an attempt to control her or buy her affection. The thought of her rejecting his gift, or worse, rejecting him, made his stomach twist with anxiety. He decided to wait until the building was finished before telling her. That way, even if she was angry with him for doing it without asking, she would at least be able to see that his intentions were good. Construction began in mid-December, and Ethan threw himself into the work with single-minded determination. He was there every day, working alongside his hired crew, sawing and hammering and hauling lumber. The physical labor helped to ease his worry, and slowly, the building began to take shape. Adelaide noticed that he seemed distracted, and one Sunday when they were riding out at his ranch, she finally asked him about it. "Is everything all right, Ethan? You seem troubled lately." He looked over at her, sitting confidently now in Daisy's saddle, her cheeks flushed from the cold and the exercise. She'd become a decent rider over the past few months, though she still preferred a walking pace to anything faster. "I'm fine," he said, which was both true and not true. "Just a new project I've taken on. Nothing for you to worry about." "Does this project have anything to do with that building that's going up on Main Street?" Adelaide asked, raising an eyebrow. "I've noticed you talking to the workers there." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't realized she'd seen him at the construction site. "You've been spying on me." "Jamestown isn't that big," Adelaide replied with a small smile. "It's hard not to notice what's going on. Mrs. Henderson mentioned that you'd bought that lot a while back. Are you building a new storefront?" "Something like that," Ethan said evasively. He didn't want to lie to her, but he wasn't ready to tell her the truth yet either. "I'll explain everything once it's finished, I promise." Adelaide looked like she wanted to press him further, but she let it drop. Ethan was grateful for that, even as he felt guilty for keeping secrets from her. They'd become close over the past few months, close enough that he knew he was in love with her, though he hadn't yet found the courage to say the words aloud. He hoped that once she saw what he was building for her, she would understand the depth of his feelings. Christmas came and went, and Ethan gave Adelaide a new set of violin strings, which she accepted with tears in her eyes. She gave him a scarf she'd knitted herself, working on it late at night after her performances, and he wore it every day even though it was a bit lumpy and uneven in places. The new year of 1883 arrived with a heavy snowfall that blanketed Jamestown and made travel difficult. Adelaide couldn't play on her corner during the worst of the weather, which meant her income dried up. Ethan saw the worry in her eyes when she mentioned that she was struggling to make rent, and he loaned her money over her protests, insisting that she could pay him back once spring came and she was performing again. By late January, the building was nearly finished. It had a wooden false front like most of the buildings in Jamestown, painted a cheerful yellow that stood out against the gray winter sky. Inside, there was a raised stage with curtains that could be drawn, wooden benches for seating, and a small area in the back that could serve as a dressing room. Ethan had even splurged on oil lamps with glass chimneys to provide good lighting. It wasn't as grand as the concert halls in Philadelphia, but it was solid and well made, and Ethan was proud of it. Now came the hard part, telling Adelaide. He chose a Sunday in early February, one of those rare winter days when the sun shone bright and the air was almost warm. He picked her up from the boarding house as usual, but instead of heading out to his ranch, he drove the wagon down Main Street and stopped in front of the yellow building. "Why are we stopping here?" Adelaide asked, looking puzzled. Ethan climbed down from the wagon and came around to help her down. His heart was pounding so hard he was sure she could hear it. "There's something I want to show you." He led her to the front door and pulled out a key, his hands shaking slightly as he unlocked it. Adelaide was watching him with curiosity and a touch of concern, but she followed him inside without protest. The interior was dim, lit only by the sunlight streaming through the windows, but Ethan had prepared for this. He quickly lit several of the lamps, and warm light flooded the space. Adelaide stood just inside the doorway, looking around with wide eyes. "Ethan," she said slowly, "what is this place?" He took a deep breath, knowing that the next few minutes would determine everything. "It's a music hall. I built it for you." Adelaide turned to stare at him, her expression unreadable. "You built it for me? What do you mean?" The words came tumbling out faster than Ethan had planned. "I've been watching you play on that street corner for months now, and I've seen how talented you are, how much joy your music brings to people. But I've also seen you shivering in the cold, seen your hands get too stiff to play properly. You deserve better than that, Adelaide. You deserve a real stage and an audience that comes specifically to hear you perform. So I built you one." Adelaide walked slowly into the center of the room, turning in a circle to take it all in. She climbed the steps to the stage and stood there for a moment, looking out at the empty benches. When she turned back to face Ethan, there were tears streaming down her face. Ethan's heart sank. "Adelaide, please don't cry. If you're angry with me, I understand. I should have asked you first, but I wanted it to be a surprise. If you don't want it, I can use the building for something else. I can." "Stop talking," Adelaide said, her voice shaking. She walked to the edge of the stage and sat down, her feet dangling over the side. "Just stop talking for a minute." Ethan fell silent, watching her anxiously as she wiped at her tears with the back of her hand. The silence stretched out, broken only by the crackling of the oil lamps. Finally, Adelaide spoke. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I've overstepped," Ethan said miserably. "I've made you uncomfortable and—" "You've given me back my dream," Adelaide interrupted. She looked up at him, her amber eyes shining with tears and something else, something that made Ethan's breath catch in his throat. "Ever since I left Philadelphia, I've been telling myself that I was fine playing on street corners, that I didn't need a real stage or a proper venue. But the truth is, I've been heartbroken. I've missed performing in front of a real audience, missed the feeling of bringing music to life in a space designed for it. And you've given that back to me." Ethan felt relief wash over him so intensely that his knees went weak. He walked over to the stage and looked up at her. "So you're not angry?" "I'm not angry," Adelaide said, and she started to laugh, a sound that was half sob. "I'm overwhelmed and grateful and a little bit terrified, if I'm being honest. Ethan, this must have cost you a fortune. How did you afford it?" "I took out a loan against my ranch," Ethan admitted. "Mr. Stevens at the bank was supportive. We worked out a payment plan that should be manageable if the music hall brings in enough revenue." Adelaide's laughter stopped abruptly. "You risked your ranch for this. For me." "I'd risk a lot more than that for you," Ethan said quietly. He knew this was the moment, knew that he needed to tell her what he'd been feeling for months now. "Adelaide, I'm in love with you. I have been since the day I first heard you play. Building this hall wasn't just about giving you a stage. It was about giving you a home, a place where you belong. I know we haven't known each other for very long, and I know you came west to be independent, to make your own way. But I hope that maybe you could make your way with me, not because you need me, but because you want to." Adelaide was crying again, but she was smiling too, and Ethan thought he'd never seen anything more beautiful in his life. She slid down from the stage and walked over to him, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. Her fingers were cold against his skin, and he could feel her trembling. "I'm in love with you too," she whispered. "I think I have been for a while now, but I was afraid to admit it, afraid that if I let myself depend on someone again, I'd lose myself. But you're not like Charles. You don't want to take away my music or control me. You want to help me soar." "Always," Ethan said. "I'll always want that." Adelaide pulled his face down to hers and kissed him, and it was nothing like the quick peck she'd given him months ago on the boarding house steps. This kiss was deep and desperate and full of all the emotion they'd been holding back. Ethan wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, and for a long moment the rest of the world ceased to exist. There was only Adelaide, her warmth and her scent, and the feeling of her heart beating against his chest. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Adelaide rested her forehead against his. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Ethan said. "Now we figure out how to make this work. We'll need to advertise, let people know that Jamestown has a proper music hall. We'll need to set ticket prices, maybe bring in other performers sometimes to give you a break, and we'll need a name for the place." "Adelaide's Music Hall," Adelaide suggested with a laugh. "Too simple," Ethan said, pretending to think seriously about it. "How about Whitmore's Music Hall?" "Presumptuous," Adelaide teased. "We're not married." "Not yet," Ethan said, and then his eyes widened as he realized what he'd said. "I mean, if you want it to be someday. Not right away. I know you value your independence, but maybe eventually." Adelaide silenced him with another kiss. "Yes," she said when she pulled back. "Someday. But let's start with the music hall and see how we do." They spent the rest of the afternoon making plans, sitting together on the edge of the stage and talking about possibilities and practicalities. Adelaide would give her first official performance the following Saturday night. They would charge 50 cents for admission, which was reasonable enough that working men could afford it, but high enough to suggest that this was something special. Ethan would spread the word throughout the week, putting up posters and talking to everyone he knew. They decided to call the venue simply The Stage, which felt appropriate given that this was where Adelaide would finally have the platform she deserved. That Saturday night, Ethan wasn't sure what to expect. He'd done everything he could to promote the event, but would people actually come? Would they pay money to hear Adelaide play when they could hear her for free on the street corner? Or would they see the music hall as a pretentious waste of time? His doubts were laid to rest when people started arriving an hour before the performance was scheduled to begin. First came the mine owners and their wives, dressed in their finest clothes and eager to show that Jamestown could be sophisticated and cultured. Then came the miners themselves, freshly scrubbed and on their best behavior. Shop owners and ranch hands, families and single men, even a few women who worked at the saloons, all of them crowding into the stage until every bench was full, and people were standing along the walls. Adelaide was backstage in the dressing room, and Ethan could see that she was nervous. Her hands were shaking as she rosined her bow, and she'd changed her mind 3 times about which dress to wear, finally settling on a simple dark blue gown that made her eyes look even more golden. When it was time for her to go on, Ethan took her hand and squeezed it gently. "You're going to be magnificent," he told her. "I believe in you." She took a deep breath and nodded. "Thank you for everything." Then she walked out onto the stage and the crowd fell silent. Ethan watched from the side as she stood there for a moment, looking out at the sea of faces. And then she raised her violin to her chin, positioned her bow, and began to play. The first piece she'd chosen was a lively folk tune, something that got people's feet tapping and brought smiles to their faces. But as the performance went on, she ranged through different styles and moods. She played classical pieces that showcased her technical skill, sweet ballads that had people swaying gently in their seats, and even a few original compositions that she'd written herself. Between songs, she spoke to the audience, telling them about the music and sharing little stories about what had inspired her. She was charming and warm, and the crowd loved her. When she played her final piece, a hauntingly beautiful melody that spoke of longing and hope, There wasn't a sound in the room except for the violin. And when the last note faded away, the audience erupted into applause so loud that Ethan thought the roof might lift off. People were standing, clapping and cheering, and Adelaide stood on stage with tears streaming down her face, bowing again and again. After the performance, people crowded around to congratulate her. The mine owner, Mr. Jacobson, said it was the finest entertainment he'd seen since leaving New York. Mrs. Murphy from the restaurant asked when the next performance would be. Even old Bill Crawford, a grizzled prospector who was known for being impossible to please, shook Adelaide's hand and said he'd never heard anything finer. Ethan watched it all with a sense of pride and satisfaction deeper than anything he'd felt even when he'd closed on his ranch. This was different from his own accomplishments. This was about helping someone he loved achieve their dreams, and it felt even better than achieving his own. As the crowd gradually dispersed and the night grew late, Ethan and Adelaide were finally alone in the music hall. They stood on the stage together, looking out at the empty benches and the lamps burning low. Adelaide was exhausted but glowing, still riding the high of a successful performance. She leaned against Ethan and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders. "We did it," she said softly. "This actually worked." "You did it," Ethan corrected. "I just built the building. You're the one who brought it to life." Adelaide tilted her head up to look at him. "We make a good team." "The best," Ethan agreed, and he kissed her there on the stage with the lamps flickering around them and the scent of wood and rosin in the air. Over the next few months, the stage became a fixture of life in Jamestown. Adelaide performed twice a week, on Saturday nights and Wednesday evenings, and the shows were always well attended. Word spread to other towns in the area, and people started traveling from as far as 20 miles away to hear the famous violinist of Jamestown. Ethan was able to start paying back his loan to the bank, slowly but steadily, and his worries about losing his ranch began to ease. But more than the financial success, what mattered to both of them was the sense of purpose and joy that the music hall brought. Adelaide was happier than Ethan had ever seen her, and he fell more in love with her every day. They continued their Sunday ritual of riding out to his ranch, and Adelaide became skilled enough on Daisy that they could take longer rides into the mountains. On one of these rides in early May, with wildflowers blooming in the meadows and the aspens bright with new leaves, Ethan finally worked up the courage to ask the question he'd been holding on to for months. They had stopped to rest by a creek, letting the horses drink, and Adelaide was sitting on a fallen log playing her violin softly. The music blended with the sound of running water and birdsong, creating a moment so perfect that Ethan felt his heart might burst. When Adelaide finished the song and lowered her violin, he knelt down in front of her, pulling a small box from his pocket. "Adelaide Turner," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I know we've only known each other for about 8 months, but they've been the best 8 months of my life. You've made me happier than I ever thought possible, and I can't imagine my future without you in it. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band set with a small amber stone that matched her eyes. He'd had it specially made by the jeweler in town, using money he'd saved from his last cattle sale. Adelaide stared at it for a moment, then at him, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, of course I'll marry you." Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger and pulled her into his arms, and they held each other for a long time while Daisy and Ranger grazed peacefully nearby. When they finally returned to town, they were both grinning like fools, and Adelaide kept looking down at her hand as if she couldn't believe the ring was real. They were married in June, on a warm Sunday afternoon with half of Jamestown in attendance. Mrs. Henderson decorated the stage with wildflowers, and the banker Mr. Stevens gave Adelaide away since her father had disowned her. Ethan wore his best suit, which he'd had tailored specially for the occasion, and Adelaide wore a cream-colored dress that she'd sewn herself with help from some of the women in town. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the crowd cheered so loudly that it could probably be heard all the way in Denver. After the wedding, there was a reception with food and music and dancing. Several of the local musicians had formed a small band to provide music, and Adelaide surprised everyone by getting up and playing a duet with old Mr. Fisher, the German immigrant who played the harmonica at the saloon. It was lively and fun and completely impromptu, and it perfectly captured the joy of the day. That night, Ethan brought Adelaide home to his ranch for the first time as his wife. He'd spent the past few weeks fixing up the cabin, adding touches he thought she might appreciate. He'd built a special shelf for her violin and her growing collection of sheet music. He'd ordered real curtains from Denver to replace the rough blankets he'd been using to cover the windows. He'd even attempted to make the bedroom more comfortable, buying a new quilt and pillows from the general store. Adelaide walked through the cabin slowly, taking in all the changes, and when she turned to look at Ethan, her eyes were shining. "It's perfect," she said. "It feels like home." "Our home," Ethan said, pulling her close, "for as long as we both shall live." That first year of marriage was the happiest time of Ethan's life. He and Adelaide fell into a comfortable rhythm, balancing the demands of the ranch and the music hall. Adelaide continued to perform twice a week, and Ethan was always in the audience, never tiring of hearing her play. The rest of the time, she helped him on the ranch, learning how to cook and keep house and even how to help with some of the lighter ranch work. She turned out to have a way with the horses, able to calm even the most skittish animals with her gentle voice and patient manner. In return, Ethan learned to appreciate music in a way he never had before. Adelaide would play for him in the evenings, sitting by the fireplace while he worked on leather or repaired tools. She taught him about different composers and musical styles, and though he would never be as educated about such things as she was, he found himself genuinely enjoying the lessons. She even tried to teach him to play the violin, though they both quickly discovered that he had no aptitude for it whatsoever. His fingers were too big and clumsy, and he couldn't seem to make anything but screeching sounds come out of the instrument. They'd laughed until their sides hurt, and Adelaide had kissed him and said she loved him anyway. By the following spring, Adelaide announced that she was expecting a baby. Ethan was terrified and thrilled in equal measure. He'd never thought much about being a father, but now that it was happening, he found himself consumed with worry about being good enough, about providing everything a child would need. Adelaide seemed much more calm about the whole thing, though Ethan suspected she had her own fears that she wasn't sharing. She continued performing at the stage through her pregnancy, only stopping in the final month when it became too uncomfortable for her to stand for long periods. The people of Jamestown were invested in the pregnancy, treating Adelaide like she was the whole town's responsibility. Women she barely knew would stop her on the street to give advice or to press gifts into her hands, little knit booties or blankets or baby gowns. Mrs. Henderson moved a younger tenant into Adelaide's old room and announced that she was keeping the rocker from that room to give to Adelaide for the baby. In October of 1884, Adelaide gave birth to a healthy baby boy after a long and difficult labor that left Ethan pacing outside their bedroom door for 12 hours, praying harder than he ever had in his life. When the midwife finally emerged and told him he had a son, he burst into the room to find Adelaide exhausted but smiling, cradling a tiny bundle in her arms. "Meet Emmett Whitmore," she said softly, pulling back the blanket so Ethan could see the baby's face. Ethan sat carefully on the edge of the bed, hardly daring to breathe as he looked at his son. Emmett had a shock of dark hair, and his eyes, when they briefly opened, were the same amber color as Adelaide's. He was so small, so perfect, and Ethan felt his heart expand in a way he hadn't known was possible. "He's beautiful," Ethan whispered, reaching out to gently touch the baby's tiny hand. Emmett's fingers wrapped instinctively around his father's finger, and Ethan felt tears prick at his eyes. "He's absolutely perfect. He has your nose," Adelaide said with a tired laugh. "Poor thing." "My nose is distinguished," Ethan protested, but he was smiling. He leaned over to kiss Adelaide's forehead. "Thank you. Thank you for this incredible gift, for our son, for everything." "Thank you," Adelaide replied, "for giving me a life I never dreamed I could have, for giving me a home and a stage and a family. Being parents changed everything and nothing all at once. The basic rhythms of their life remained the same, but now everything revolved around Emmett." Adelaide took a break from performing for several months while she recovered and adjusted to motherhood, and Ethan hired a young cowhand named Tommy to help with the ranch work so he could spend more time at home. The cabin that had seemed perfectly adequate suddenly felt cramped, so Ethan began planning an addition, a second bedroom and a larger living space. Emmett was a good baby, generally content and healthy, though like all infants, he had his fussy periods. Ethan discovered that the best way to calm him was to walk him around while singing, though his singing voice was terrible and Adelaide would laugh every time she heard him. But Emmett didn't seem to mind, and he would usually settle right down. When Emmett was 4 months old, Adelaide decided she was ready to start performing again. They worked out a system where Mrs. Henderson would watch Emmett during Adelaide's performances, and Adelaide would nurse him right before and right after. It wasn't perfect, and Adelaide struggled with guilt about leaving her baby even for a few hours, but she also missed performing, missed the connection she felt with her audience and the satisfaction of bringing beauty into the world through her music. The people of Jamestown were thrilled to have her back on stage, and her first performance after Emmett's birth was sold out. She played with a passion and depth that seemed even greater than before, and afterward, several people mentioned that becoming a mother seemed to have added new dimensions to her art. Adelaide laughed and said that exhaustion and baby spit up were interesting muses, but Ethan could see that she was pleased by the compliments. Life continued in this pleasant way for several years. Emmett grew from a baby into a toddler, then into a little boy with his mother's musical inclinations and his father's stubborn determination. He loved nothing more than to sit quietly in the stage during his mother's performances, his small face serious as he listened to her play. For his 4th birthday, Adelaide bought him a tiny violin from a catalog, and he started learning the basics under her patient instruction. Meanwhile, the stage had become more than just a music hall. It had become the cultural heart of Jamestown, a place where the community gathered not just for Adelaide's performances, but for town meetings, for traveling theatrical troupes, for debates and lectures and celebrations. Ethan and Adelaide hosted a Christmas concert every year that had become a beloved tradition, with Adelaide playing and various townspeople contributing other talents, from singing to poetry recitations to comedy acts. The ranch was thriving too. Ethan had expanded his cattle operation and was now one of the more successful ranchers in the area. He'd built the addition to the cabin, and it was comfortable and spacious, with large windows that let in plenty of light and a proper music room where Adelaide could practice without disturbing Emmett when he was sleeping. He'd also built a larger barn and several new outbuildings, and he employed 3 full-time ranch hands who helped with the work. On a warm June evening in 1889, Ethan and Adelaide sat on their porch watching the sun set over the mountains while Emmett played with a wooden horse that Ethan had carved for him. Adelaide was pregnant again, just beginning to show, and she rested her hand on her belly with a contented smile. "Can you believe it's been 7 years since I first came to Jamestown?" she said. 7 years since I was playing on that street corner, wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake leaving Philadelphia. "Best 7 years of my life," Ethan replied, reaching over to take her hand. "Best decision I ever made, stopping to listen to you play that day. The best decision I ever made was accepting your dinner invitation," Adelaide said. "Even though I was terrified that you were going to be another Charles, someone who would try to control me or change me. But you weren't. You've only ever wanted me to be myself." "Always," Ethan said, bringing her hand to his lips and kissing it gently. "I fell in love with who you are. Why would I want to change that?" They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching as the sky turned pink and gold. Emmett had abandoned his toy horse and was now trying to catch fireflies in the gathering dusk, his laughter ringing out clear and bright. Ethan thought about how much his life had changed since Adelaide had come into it, how she'd transformed him from a lonely rancher focused only on survival into a husband and father with a family and a purpose beyond just making it through another day. "I love you," he said, though they said it to each other every day. It never got old, never stopped feeling important. "I love you too," Adelaide replied, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Thank you for building me a stage and a home and a life worth living." Their second child, a daughter they named Emma, was born that December. She had Ethan's dark brown eyes and Adelaide's musical talent, though that wouldn't become apparent for a few years yet. Emmett was thrilled to have a little sister and took his role as big brother very seriously, always wanting to help feed her or rock her cradle or fetch whatever Adelaide needed. The years that followed were full and rich, marked by the everyday joys and struggles of raising a family and running both a ranch and a music hall. There were hard times, too. The winter of 1891 was brutal, and they lost several head of cattle to the cold. Emma went through a scary bout of scarlet fever when she was 3, and Ethan barely slept for a week until the fever finally broke. There were years when the music hall barely broke even, and Ethan had to carefully manage their finances to keep everything afloat. But through it all, Ethan and Adelaide faced everything together. They'd learned to lean on each other to share both burdens and triumphs. They'd learned to communicate honestly, even when it was difficult, and to always put their family first. And through it all, their love for each other only deepened and grew stronger. Adelaide never stopped performing, though as the children got older and the demands of family life increased, she cut back to 1 performance a week. She also started teaching violin to some of the children in town, holding lessons in the music room at their house. Emmett showed real promise on the instrument, though he was more interested in horses and ranching like his father. Emma, on the other hand, was completely devoted to music from the time she could hold a violin, and by the time she was 8, she was already performing alongside her mother occasionally at the stage. In 1895, Adelaide received a letter that caught her completely by surprise. It was from her father in Philadelphia, whom she hadn't heard from since he'd disowned her 13 years earlier. The letter was short and formal, but it conveyed that her father was ill, that he regretted the rift between them, and that he hoped she might consider visiting him before it was too late. Adelaide showed the letter to Ethan, her hands shaking. "I don't know what to do," she said. "Part of me wants to tear this up and pretend I never received it." He threw me away, told me I was worthless because I wouldn't marry Charles. Why should I care if he regrets it now? Ethan pulled her into his arms, holding her while she trembled with anger and hurt. You should care because you're not him, he said gently. You're better than that, more forgiving, and because if you don't go and he dies, you might regret it for the rest of your life. Would you come with me? Adelaide asked. I don't think I can face him alone. Of course I'll come, Ethan said. We'll all go. It's time your father met his grandchildren. The trip to Philadelphia was Emmett and Emma's first real journey beyond Colorado, and they were awed by everything they saw. The train ride itself was an adventure, and when they finally arrived in the bustling city, so different from the mountains and open spaces they knew, both children pressed their faces to the windows in wonder. Adelaide's father lived in a modest townhouse on a tree-lined street, and when a servant showed them into the parlor, Ethan could see Adelaide's hands clenching nervously. Her father was waiting in a chair by the window, and he looked much older than Ethan had expected, his face gaunt and his hands trembling with palsy. But his eyes, the same amber color as Adelaide's and Emma's, were sharp and alert. There was a long, awkward silence, and then Adelaide's father spoke. You look well, Adelaide, better than I expected, given that you threw away your future to run off to the wilderness. Ethan felt Adelaide stiffen beside him, and he placed a gentle hand on her back in support. But before Adelaide could respond, Emma, who was 10 years old and had inherited her mother's forthright nature, stepped forward. Mama didn't throw away her future, she said clearly. She made a new one. She's famous in Jamestown and people come from all over to hear her play. She has a beautiful family and a real stage where she performs, not just concert halls where people are too stuffy to really appreciate music. Adelaide's father looked startled, then something that might have been a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Is this my granddaughter? This is Emma, Adelaide said, her voice tight with emotion. And this is Emmett and my husband, Ethan Whitmore. Papa, if I came here just to be insulted again, we can leave right now. No, please. The old man held up a shaking hand. I'm sorry, that came out wrong. I've been practicing what to say for weeks, and I still managed to say the exact wrong thing. Please, sit down. Let me explain. They sat, though Adelaide remained tense and ready to bolt at any moment. Her father took a deep breath and began to speak, and the words came slowly at first, then faster, like a dam breaking. He talked about how wrong he'd been to prioritize social status over her happiness, how he'd realized too late that he'd valued his pride more than his own daughter. He talked about how he'd followed her career from afar, getting news from former students who'd traveled west and happened to hear her play. He talked about how proud he was of what she'd accomplished, and how he'd longed to reach out but hadn't known how to bridge the gap his own stubbornness had created. I'm dying, he said finally, his voice breaking. The doctors say I have maybe 6 months. And I couldn't die without telling you that I was wrong, without asking for your forgiveness even though I don't deserve it. You were right to refuse Charles. He was a terrible man, and you were brave to stand up for yourself. You were always braver than I was. Adelaide was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face. Ethan squeezed her hand, and after a moment she stood and walked over to her father's chair. She knelt down beside him and took his trembling hands in hers. I forgive you, Papa, she whispered. I forgave you a long time ago, even if I didn't realize it. I was so angry for so long, but Ethan taught me that holding on to anger only hurts yourself. I've been happy, Papa. My life has been good, but I'm glad you reached out. I'm glad I got to hear you say this. They stayed in Philadelphia for 2 weeks, and during that time, Adelaide and her father rebuilt their relationship as much as they could in the time that remained. He was fascinated by Emmett and Emma, asking them endless questions about their lives in Colorado. He asked Adelaide to play for him, and she did, pulling out her violin right there in his parlor and performing some of her favorite pieces. By the time they left, there were no more hard feelings, only love and the bittersweet knowledge that they didn't have much time left together. Adelaide's father passed away 4 months later, in early 1896. He left his modest estate to Adelaide, enough money that Ethan was able to pay off the last of his loan on the stage and put aside a good amount for Emmett and Emma's futures. But more valuable than the money was the peace Adelaide felt, knowing that she'd reconciled with her father before it was too late. The years continued to pass, marked by the milestones of family life. Emmett grew into a fine young man, tall and capable, with his father's work ethic and his mother's sensitivity. At 18, he announced that he wanted to work the ranch with Ethan, and though Adelaide had hoped he might pursue music more seriously, she supported his choice. Emma, meanwhile, was performing regularly at the stage by the time she was 15, and it was clear to everyone that she had inherited her mother's extraordinary talent. In 1900, Emmett met a young woman named Sarah who had come to Jamestown with her family, homesteaders looking for good land to farm. She was pretty and practical and shared Emmett's love of the outdoors, and Ethan and Adelaide both approved when he asked permission to court her. They were married the following year, and Ethan helped them build a small house on the edge of his property. A year later, they had a baby girl, making Ethan and Adelaide grandparents for the first time. Emma, meanwhile, had received an offer to study at a prestigious music conservatory in New York. It was the same kind of opportunity Adelaide had once dreamed of, and she encouraged her daughter to take it, even though it meant Emma would be gone for months at a time. Emma flourished there, but she always came back to Jamestown for the summers, performing at the stage and helping her mother teach the next generation of young musicians. As Ethan and Adelaide grew older, they gradually stepped back from some of their responsibilities. Ethan turned over more and more of the ranch operations to Emmett, though he still went out most days to check on things and to help with the work he was still capable of doing. Adelaide continued to perform, though not as frequently, and she focused more on teaching and mentoring young musicians. The stage remained the heart of Jamestown's cultural life, and both their children took active roles in keeping it running. On their 25th wedding anniversary in 1909, the town threw a big celebration at the stage. Nearly everyone in Jamestown attended, along with people from neighboring towns who traveled in for the occasion. There were speeches and performances, and Emmett and Emma teamed up to play a beautiful duet they'd been secretly practicing for months. At the end of the evening, Adelaide took to the stage one more time, her violin in hand. She was 50 years old now, her dark hair streaked with gray, but she was still beautiful, still graceful, still capable of drawing magic from her instrument. 25 years ago, she said to the crowd, I married the best man I've ever known. He gave me a stage and a home and a life beyond anything I'd dreamed was possible. This song is for him. She played The Last Rose of Summer, a melody Ethan recognized as the first song she'd ever performed for him at the stage all those years ago. He sat in the front row, just as he always did during her performances, and he felt tears streaming down his face as he listened. When the last note faded away, Adelaide set down her violin and walked down from the stage. She came to Ethan and took his hand, and they stood together while the crowd applauded. I love you, she said, just loud enough for him to hear over the noise. Thank you for everything. I love you too, Ethan replied. Always have, always will. They lived for many more years, watching their family grow and their legacy take root. Emmett and Sarah had 3 more children, all of whom loved the ranch as much as their father did. Emma eventually married a music professor from New York and had 2 children of her own, a boy and a girl who both showed musical talent. The stage continued to thrive, becoming known throughout Colorado as a place where real culture could be found, even in a small mountain town. Ethan passed away in 1923 at the age of 67, dying peacefully in his sleep after a good day spent working on the ranch and having dinner with his family. Adelaide was devastated by his loss, but she took comfort in the life they'd built together and the family they'd created. She continued teaching music and occasionally performing until her own death 4 years later at the age of 68. They were buried together on a hill overlooking the ranch, with headstones that read simply Ethan Whitmore, beloved husband, father, and builder, and Adelaide Whitmore, beloved wife, mother, and musician. The stage continued to operate, passed down through the family, and in 1950, Emma's daughter Ruth had a plaque installed on the front of the building that read, "The stage, built in 1882 by Ethan Whitmore for his love, Adelaide Turner, violinist." The story of the cowboy who built a stage for the woman who played on street corners became a legend in Jamestown, told and retold through the generations. It was a story about love and courage, about taking risks and following your dreams, about building something beautiful and lasting in the harsh wilderness of the American West. It was a story that reminded people that even in the hardest times, even in the most unlikely places, love could flourish and create something wonderful. And long after Ethan and Adelaide were gone, their music, their love, and their legacy lived on, echoing through the mountains and valleys of Colorado, a testament to the power of one man's devotion and one woman's art and the beautiful life they built together.